Okay, so I'm going to kind of stand here, I guess, and go over it, and project it on the screen. So first, is Aquinas correct to hold that things in nature that lack a mind or intelligence and yet fulfill a purpose must have been made externally and directed externally to fulfill their purpose? So this is obviously Aquinas' version of the design argument from his Fifth Way. That's what this centers on. By the way, remember to put the number of the question you're answering, because you'll see some of these are similar. There is overlap, and it might make a difference as to how I grade yours, whether I think you're addressing what was asked, if I think you're answering a different question than the one you're trying to answer. So make it clear which question you're answering. And of course, use my number. Again, I was trying to say I always get a few people per test who, because this is the second essay you're writing for the course, even though you're answering question 6, you'll put 2 on there as a 2. No, I don't care. I know it's the second essay you're writing for the course. I want to know what question you're trying to answer. And it's unnecessary to copy the question. If you want to, fine, if that helps you in your writing to have it right there in front of you. But I know what the questions are. Okay. So you don't have to copy the question, but make sure you number your answer with the number of the question you're answering. So, so the point is, Aquinas is saying that there are things in nature that do not have a mind or intelligence, that lack, as he says, understanding, and yet they fulfill purposes. So he's saying if they don't have a mind, if they don't have intelligence, then they're not going to fulfill that purpose themselves. They can't direct themselves to do that. They need to be directed by an intelligence. And of course, in terms of the creation of the world, the intelligence is, for Aquinas, the God of the Bible and church tradition. Now, the thing is, he thinks they have to have had an external designer or intelligence. Now, I say, or instead, does Hume seem to you to be correct when he speculates that an unknown causal principle in matter itself might direct things in nature toward order and purpose? In other words, if we have order in nature, is it possible to account for it in totally naturalistic terms? That is, by referring to forces within nature rather than an external designer and creator. Now, we saw, if you go back and look at those slides from Hume, and yes, when I say your test is not going to include Hume, it's not going to include the PowerPoint part of Hume, but it certainly is going to include Hume's criticisms of the design argument. So, so Hume is a non-scientist, and he's writing in the 1770s or 60s, and so he's using some of the common knowledge science of his day to speculate that there are principles in nature that might tend toward order, heat and cold, magnetism, principles like that. Hume is making a logical point. He's saying, well, it's just as easy to conclude that some principle in nature, even if we don't know what that principle is, might be responsible for order in things than to conclude alternatively that it's an intelligent designer, right? Now, of course, Aquinas uses the illustration of an intelligent archer needing to direct an arrow towards its target for it to fulfill its goal of reaching the target. Now, where evolution comes in is it tries to make specific just what that internal causal principle is, right? As I said before, Darwin's original concept of evolution is as a non-directed process, a totally random statistical process that is aiming at no particular goal or end. That it produced us is a happy accident in Darwin's terms, right? But it gives us internal principles that there's a vast struggle for survival that all organisms are engaged in and have been engaged in since their existence, since they came into existence for millions of years. And it basically says that within this struggle to survival, organisms have learned to adapt to their environment, and that there are members of a species that will produce advantageous variations. That is, they will have adaptions like better eyes, longer necks for giraffes, that give them a leg up, metaphorically speaking, in the struggle for survival, and that those members of the species are what will survive and others die out. So, so basically, Darwin speculates that that over the course of millions of years, we can have organisms that develop more and more sophisticated and complex eyes as a result of adjusting to their environment and not as the result of an external directedness. So, so Hume and Darwin would see something like the eye as not having an analogy to a house or to a watch, because they would say it's not something that was thought up and designed and built all at once, but it was developed as over millions of years by natural processes. Now, I gave my own personal slant on this. My problem with evolution does not come when you've got organisms that are developed enough to adapt to their environment and produce advantageous variations. You can tell a very good story from a totally random naturalistic point of view. My problem comes with how do you get even the first strands of DNA from a totally non-directed naturalistic process, But again, you can remember, I'm not grading you as to whether or not you take a slant on any of these questions that happens to be where I'm coming from. I try to be objective and non-involved and just grade your essay on how well you make the case for whatever position you take, okay? And this is one of the benefits of a philosophy course that we mentioned at the beginning. This is one reason why it's in the curriculum, not just for the specific matter, for giving you knowledge of what Plato said and what Descartes and Berkeley said. But a philosophy course can help you to think critically and know how to defend a position you take, because you will need those skills not just in other courses where you have to write something or defend something, but out there in the real world, and so okay, so number 2 is related to it, and there's overlap here. Give William Paley's version of the design argument, and I'm not going to repeat it here, but basically we saw that he draws an analogy between a watch, a designed item, and something like the eye. And he says they have similarities in that they have intricate parts that work together to enable them to fulfill a purpose or function. And if that's the case, and the watch needed a designer, why wouldn't the eye need a designer as well? And of course, who would the designer of the eye be other than God himself? So Paley says that it's crazy to think that an organ like the eye is anything other than strong evidence of design, of a designer, namely evidence for God. So I ask you to weigh in on that. And to summarize Paley, here again, if you're going to write on this one, you'll develop a better essay if you not only look at the PowerPoint, but look at the selection from Paley, either in your textbook, or if you, for one reason or other, still haven't gotten your textbook, looking at it in that there's a selection, I believe, in the reading section. So, in supplemental readings. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. 3 is an overlap. Would Hume agree with Cleanthes that the design argument alone can serve as the cornerstone of a rationally based faith? If yes, why? If no, and of course the answer really isn't. I mean, he holds no, it can't. Then why? Why does he say? Is more than one conclusion possible from the premises? And of course here, the thing to do is, and there is the selection that this was taken from also, although I haven't mentioned it very much, but it's there in supplemental readings if you want to write on this. But the selection from Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. But the thing is, what you want to do is look at Hume's arguments, at least in the PowerPoint, and his claim that from the same premises you can get other conclusions than the one that Cleanthes wants us to draw, right? The Cleanthes wants us basically to draw the same conclusion that Paley and Thomas Aquinas want us to draw, that there must have been a designer of something like the eye, and it had to have been a God of supreme intelligence capable of designing something that complex. Whereas Hume speculates, and you got to understand where Hume is going at on this. Hume's not saying, you know what, rather than the God of the Bible, I think the designer of the universe was an inept, infant, senile deity at the end of his career, or an unthinking, new, infantile deity who was just learning how to make worlds. It's not that Hume is advocating these himself. He's making a logical point. He's saying from the same set of presuppositions that you get in the design argument, more than one conclusion is possible besides the one that Cleanthes, Aquinas, and Paley want us to draw. And so he speculates about what those. He says, you can't even get from the same premises that the designer of the world was one designer. Could have been designed by committee, you know. And so these are the things you would want to bring in if you're trying to answer question 3. Question 4, we segue into Descartes, right? I gave you several versions of, or several names for Descartes' method, all of which are used. The one that I think is used in the literature on Descartes more than any other is methodic doubt. Some people also call it methodological skepticism. Another name for it highlights just how unusual and way out in left field Descartes' doubt is. They call it hyperbolic doubt. Remember, hyperbole is exaggerating something. So that tells it right then and there that it's not a normal doubt, right? Now, we've gone over Descartes, but how does he use this method to question what his senses tell him? Well, there is where he brings in the conjecture that he might be dreaming, right? That even if his senses convey something very clearly, he's had vivid dreams from which he is awakened. So he raises the question, why couldn't he be dreaming now? And he tries to convince us that there aren't any sure ways of distinguishing a dreaming from a waking state, right? So now, why does the dream conjecture not work to throw doubt on arithmetic and geometry? Well, there again, his claim is that even in a dream, a square is still going to have 4 sides, right? 2 plus 3 is still going to equal 5. The basic principles of mathematics are still going to hold. So even if what we're talking about is math that relates to dream objects, an unreal square is still going to have 4 sides. And I make this point, you know. And so how does he question these? Well, here's where we really get the hyperbole and hyperbolic doubt. How does he raise doubt about the truths of mathematics? There's where he brings in that speculation about an evil genie or evil demon deceiving him about even the mathematical proofs. And I said, the way you can make this believable for yourself is to, again, ask yourself if you've ever gotten less than 100% on a math test. And you say, well, yeah, because I was working through the problem and I made a mistake somewhere. I screwed up. Well, imagine that there's some evil entity, the evil genius, whispering in your ear every time you did a math problem. And you say, well, doggone it, that's why I got such poor grades in math. The evil genius was there all the time trying to mess me up. Here I thought it was just because I never studied. You know, in other words, imagine that some evil entity is whispering in your ear, throwing you off track when you're trying to do the math problem. Well, you can say, well, this is really way out there in left field. Yeah, but Descartes thinks that even if the theoretical doubt he raises is a really hypothetical, way out in left field kind of doubt, Nonetheless, he thinks that's enough to show that what he's dealing with is not absolutely certain. Now, most modern day logicians think that the principles of mathematics, unless we're talking statistics, are absolutely certain. It's the same kind of absolutely certain deductive reasoning. But Descartes says, I can raise a doubt. So to continue on, you know, again, I'm trying to review things, but also let you know if you're wanting to write on this one. Is there are all truths brought into doubt? Does any belief survive? Well, of course, the belief that survives is the cogito ergo sum. By the way, if you want to sound like you know what you're doing, just refer to the cogito, like it's assumed that that people understand. See, because that's really at the graduate level, you know, or professional philosophers, it's just the cogito. And everybody, they assume that the professional they're talking to or the fellow graduate student understands what they mean. Right, it's the I think, therefore I am. So we saw that that's the one Archimedean point that he has, the one point of certainty that he comes up with, you know. Now, we also saw that Descartes does not want to end there. He wants to begin there, but he wants to set knowledge on a firm basis by giving it the same basis in absolute certain truths as geometry does. Remember, it's based on a few axioms. I'll say more about that when we look at the review sheet. Now, on question 5, I did not say a lot about the mind-body problem, but if you're thinking of writing on this, you might want to make sure you read the text on mind-body problem. I don't say a lot of it. And see, these things really are self-aware, even though people think. And sometimes they just say, you know what, I can mess Vic up if I just go blank right when he's trying to say something, you know. See, these machines really are evil sometimes. Anyway, as I was saying before the computers so rudely interrupted me, Common 5 is about the mind-body problem. Common sense tells us that if mind and body are separate, they causally interact, right? Things that happen to my body, like kicking something, can cause a mental event like pain. I can have a mental event like deciding to raise my right arm, and my right arm raises, right? We think the interaction goes both ways. But what causes for Descartes the traditional mind-body problem, the problem about how can mind and body interact, is the fact that he defines mind and body so differently. The primary property of a material object for Descartes is extension and location in Newtonian space, as well as having some of the other primary properties Locke talks about. The primary property of immaterial substance, of mind, for Descartes is thought. Well, think about it. Think about the idea that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? Keep that thought in your mind. Now picture a cow, like the cow in the Eat More Chicken ads, right? Now, is your thought about the cow over or under or to the left or right of your thought about 2 plus 2 equals 4? You say, that doesn't seem to make any sense. Doesn't seem to make any sense to say one thought is to the left or right or in front of or behind another thought. In other words, it doesn't seem to make much sense to say thoughts are located in Newtonian space the way that coffee cup is. So what's the point of bringing this up? Well, immaterial substance is not located in Newtonian space for Descartes, but the body is. The mind is not. Well, if I make coffee, right, and I heat water in a tea kettle for coffee, because I like the old Melita system, I'm not going to be very successful at heating water if I turn on the stove, the burner, and place the tea kettle across the room, right? It's got to be right next to it. I'm not going to be successful in hitting the 8-ball with the cue ball if I never get the 8-ball to touch the cue ball to touch the 8-ball, right? Cause and effect need to be located next to one another in space, right? I need to strike the match on the striker to get it to light up. The problem is Cartesian minds aren't even located in Newtonian space. So how can they causally interact? Plus, minds don't have the property of being extended and located and occupying space the way material objects do. So how does Descartes try to solve this problem himself? He speculates that the interaction between the immaterial mind and the material body takes place in this little gland at the base of the brain called the pineal gland. Now, there are some problems with this, big problems. One is that there's absolutely no observational evidence to indicate that that's the function of the pineal gland. So there's no evidential support for Descartes' speculation that that's where interaction takes place, that it's what's called the locus of interaction. But also, there's no, let's put it this way. What is the pineal gland? It's a material object. Descartes has as much of a problem explaining how the immaterial mind can move the pineal gland as he does in explaining how it can affect the body as a whole. So speculating that the pineal gland is the seat of interaction between mind and body just kicks the problem back a notch, and it doesn't solve it. So anyway, that's what 5 is about. We didn't discuss the mind-body problem. I'm probably not going to give you much by way of questions on that. But I went over 5 just because we did mention it and it was in the video. And if that interests you, you know, it's something you can write on. Number 6, well, Descartes thinks a lot of these ideas are innate, right? He thinks like his idea of God is innate, of perfection and infinity, and they have to have God as their cause. God plants these innate ideas in us. For somebody like Locke, who rejects our having innate ideas, his problem and the problem of the other empiricists is to try to explain how it is we can have some concepts that seem to relate to nothing that our senses ever had us acquainted with, like God himself directly, or like infinity, or like, perfection. We saw Socrates argue that in order to talk about imperfect equality, we had to already have the concept of perfect equality, but we couldn't acquire it in this life because no two things are perfectly equal, so it had to be innate. So the problem for Locke is to explain how it is we can have these concepts if we have no innate ideas. And so it's incumbent upon him, since he rejects innate ideas, to provide some alternative account. And basically what he's saying is the ability of the mind to imagine things, our powers of imagination and our powers of reasoning, can enable us to construct from what we do experience these concepts. In other words, from finite duration in time, we can imagine what infinite duration in time would be. From knowing something about finite space, we can imagine infinite space. From understanding what an imperfect X is, like an imperfect rose, we can mentally imagine taking away those imperfections, and we can get an idea of what a perfect thing would be. And he says we can do this with all the attributes of God, and there's a slide that explains that. So what he's trying to do then is offer an account of how the mind can construct these concepts that people from all the way back from Socrates down to Descartes said are innate. And when my geometry teachers at Poly called a perfect triangle an imaginary triangle, they were operating in the same empirical tradition. In other words, for them, there are no perfect triangles in this world, but basically, we can construct, we can imagine what a perfect triangle is. So for them, a perfect triangle is an imaginary object, just like a unicorn or a centaur is an imaginary thing. So this is a story then that Locke gives, that our powers of imagination and reasoning can enable us to construct these ideas from things we do experience, and they don't have to be innate in us. So, come on in. Okay. Number 7, I ask you to put yourself in Berkeley's place. Give a convincing argument for the thesis that all the objects of experience are mind-dependent. So we said what Berkeley does is he provides arguments that agree with Locke on the secondary properties. To understand Berkeley's view, you need to first understand that from our perspective, a material object is nothing but a conglomeration of its properties, of its primary and secondary properties. And Locke got us half the way to Berkeley because he argues that secondary properties like colors, taste, sounds, smells, basically secondary properties are the properties that deal with only one sense, right? By the nose we have smell, by, our ears we hear sounds, etc. Whereas usually primary properties can be known by more than one sense, right? by the sense of touch, I can feel along that table and feel that it's rectangular if the lights were all out or if I were blind. But I can also see that it's rectangular. Well, remember, Locke's story is that the primary properties are really in things independently of our perceiving them. In other words, for Locke, there's a real world and a real table there that has primary properties like location and extension in space, hardness. It has a rectangular shape, the top of the table. In the real world, because shape's a primary property, it has weight, it has size, it has number. It's one table, not two, right? Whereas for Locke, like the brown color, the tan color at the top of the table is subjective and in us. So what Berkeley did was also provide arguments to show that the primary properties are also mind-dependent, you know. And I give you an example of the type of argument he used. And you can, you know, maybe read a little bit more from your book on this in the Berkeley selection. So that's basically, you know, I asked you to try to see if you could convince somebody of something that none of us is convinced of, right? Berkeley says his view is a common sense view. And it's funny, Berkeley says, skeptic? I'm no skeptic. Why are you charging me with skepticism just because I claim that there's no material world? He says, what is a skeptic but somebody who doubts of things? I'm not telling you to doubt whether a material world exists. I'm telling you straight off there is no material world, so I'm not a skeptic. But David Hume, the famous skeptic, later said that Berkeley's ideas are only skeptical can be seen from this, that they admit of no refutation and produce no conviction. What does he mean? Even if we don't know how to answer Berkeley's arguments, they produce no conviction in us that he's right. We're not ready to say, you know what, Berkeley? Doggone, you're right. There is no such thing as a material world. It's all mental. My desk that I'm sitting on is just a collection of ideas. Sure, Berkeley, you're right about that. In other words, Hume talks about skepticism. He says, you know, I can write all these skeptical arguments in my study, but when I go down and I eat dinner with my friends and I play backgammon, he was a backgammon player, was popular in his day. He says, I go back up and I look at these skeptical arguments and they seem so cold and distant to me. But nonetheless, Hume was saying, I have to act like everybody else, like there's a real world full of real people that I really know is there, that I continue as the same person. But we will see that he says, I can't justify any of that stuff philosophically, so I have to be a skeptic and withhold assent. Okay, so I wanted to go over, and basically we went over Locke's distinction between primary and secondary properties quite a bit, which is what 8. So I wanted to go through this, but also make it a sort of review session, but also help anybody. Again, I want to remind you, if you want to send me a draft, I'll do some comments on it as time permits. But don't send it to me late Sunday night, right? Give me some time to answer it. And so Friday we'll go through some more of the review sheet. Systematically. Okay, if anybody missed a roll, this is a roll for the other class. That's not yours. Or make sure you have a copy. Okay, those are two of the same thing. If you need the questions, well, there's a copy of the essay question sheet. Okay. Okay.